1066 is best remembered as the year of Hastings and of the Norman conquest, yet it was in fact a much grander saga and a year of 3 great battles which relate to each other in bringing about the final victory of Duke William's forces by the year's end. Today, in this second of 3 episodes on the battles of this tumultuous year, we look at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, which if not for Hastings just weeks later, may have ranked alongside other great English victories, such as over the Spanish Armada in the Elizabethan age, or over the Luftwaffe in the Battle of Britain. Of course, this battle has 2 main protagonists, however the life of King Harold Godwinson will be thoroughly covered in a separate and epic biographical documentary coming sometime this year in 2021. So today we will also focus on the life of Harald Sigurdsson leading up to and including Stamford Bridge. The setting is late September of 1066, however the road to Stamford Bridge began long before that, in around 1015, in the windswept and frozen lands of Norway, the heart of Viking territory. The story of Harald Sigurdsson, known to most today as Harald Hardrada or Hardrada, really began about a century before his birth. Norway had been a region of petty kings, in which absolute property rights prevailed. Nobility within the area was essentially a free landholding class that could redeem lands lost from their kinship group. However, with the emergence of Harald Fairhair, all this had changed. Harald unified the petty lordships under his own suzerainty and imposed a land or personal tax. This created the familiar quasi-feudal relationship, which became widespread throughout Western Europe as time ground on. This abolishment of the bonda led to high levels of noble immigration, yet the new system created a form of kingship that both Olaf Haraldson and later Harold himself would emulate. The king could levy a personal tax or tax the income of his subjects. He could even monopolise a trade. To solidify this new setup, 2 new classes of nobility were also created. Firstly, the Hird, or personal armed retinue of the king. This basically mirrors the function of the later English housecarls, or the personal men of the English nobility. Secondly were the lendermen, that is, local officials such as sheriffs, administrators, and tax collectors. These men, in return for their service in enforcing the king's laws and taxes, held lifetime tenancy over royal lands, from which they drew an income. However, it would be erroneous to think that they in turn lorded over subtenants, as this was not an arrangement in the true feudal sense. Harold's centralisation of Norway formed the foundation for the later reign of his descendant of the same name, yet there was another key figure who played a central role in the life of Harald Hardrada, his half-brother Olaf Haraldson, or Saint Olaf, the man arguably most directly responsible for transitioning the stubborn Norse into Christians. Before Olaf, there was another Olaf, just to confuse matters. He was Olaf Tryggvason, probably the man who commanded the Vikings at the Battle of Malden, which they defeated an English army under Byrhtnoth in 991. Olaf's conversion to Christianity and his subsequent aggressive attitude in promoting his own religion back home did much to shake up the nobility to action. Twinned with their inherent opposition to the still relatively new centralisation of the Norman monarchs, Olaf, the great-grandson of Harald Fairhair, was killed in battle fighting an alliance including rebellious Norse lords, as well as the kings of Denmark and Sweden in the year of 1000. This was indeed both a blow to Christianity's growth in these lands and the power of the kingship. Yet, though Norway would once again fragment for some 16 years, a minor king descended from Harald Fairhair, Harald Grensky, did sire a boy known to history as Olaf Haraldson. Though his father died before his birth, Olaf was destined for great deeds, as at 15 he headed out on an epic Viking expedition, firstly to Denmark, then Sweden, Finland, and then Holland. In 1009, Olaf also resided in England, where he remained for around 4 years, before spending 2 further years among his cousins in Normandy. It is thought that it was here that he was baptised into the Christian faith and infused with a new zeal to reclaim both his birthright and to Christianise his Norse countrymen. In 1015, at around age 22, Olaf set sail. Remarkably, the young man's iron will, even his fanaticism, won out, and he persuaded the petty lords to support him, culminating in his victory over Jarl Sven at the Battle of Nesjar in 1016. Sven, who had ruled the Swedish part of Norway since Olaf Tryggvason's demise 16 years earlier, was forced into exile in Sweden, while Olaf Haraldson was proclaimed king at a gathering of lords. Olaf finally received recognition from the Swedes in 1019, which may have fostered in him a false sense of security, since in the years ahead he began tightening royal authority over the semi-independent petty kingdoms, whilst also imposing his Christian faith at the point of a sword, even blinding and maiming those that refused to accept Christ. This was not without some success. Olaf built on the efforts of his predecessor Tryggvason, bringing with him many bishops and missionaries from England. The coastal areas were receptive to the king's faith, yet all Olaf's aggressive efforts did inland was to drive old pagan religion underground. Olaf, however, was more than a zealot, even crafting an extensive civil code of law, as well as an intricate set of ecclesiastical laws. He also did his fair share of conquering, rebuilding the city of Nidaros, while bringing the Orkney Islands back under Norse sway. 1016 had been Olaf's year, however it was also the golden year of an even greater king, Knut Svensson. Knut had finally finished his father, King Sweyn of Denmark's work in the same year, bringing the rich and powerful Kingdom of England under his authority, extending his power in 1018 over his homeland Denmark. Knut now jealously eyed Norway, considering Olaf as a mere voice king under his greater authority. Knut did not have to look far for allies in his endeavour to add Olaf's crown to his collection. By 1028, many Norse magnates, angry at Olaf's overmighty reach into their own domains with his lendermen, and perhaps sweetened further with bribes and promises of land, sided decisively with Knut when a large fleet was sighted off the coast. Olaf, overwhelmed with nearly no support, fled east to Sweden and then to the court, Grand Duke Yaroslav at Kiev. However, all was not quite lost for Olaf, who simply bided his time. Knut's appointed Jarl Hakon Eriksson did not long serve as his regent, drowning soon after and leaving the way open for Olaf's return. Among Olaf's number returning via Sweden were some Varangian Guard mercenaries recruited from Constantinople, yet the small army of around 2,500 men that Olaf moved into Norway with was mostly comprised of green levies. It is now that Harald Sigurdsson emerges into the full light of history in our story. Harald was among those men who flocked to his half-brother's banner. Even then he was a towering presence, at just 15 years old, yet evidently more than capable of doing his part to enforce his brother's claim to the Norwegian throne. Harald was born in around 1015, as Olaf was first pressing his claim to kingship, the two men sharing a mother, who with her second husband, Sigurdsson, had sired Harald. According to some sagas, though Harald himself was not descended from Harald Fairhair through the same line as Olaf, he was, through his own father, who traced his lineage back through 2 generations, pioneering king, though this is disputed among modern historians. It appears that Harald and Olaf's mother was a formidable influence on all her sons, having married again after Harald Grensky's death to Sigurdsson. Sigurd, Harald's father, was a minor king of Ringerike, and though among the most powerful of the lords of the uplands, had no ambition to advance further, a fact that apparently rankled with his wife Asta, who was reported to have told Olaf that, "If I had the choice, I would rather you became king of all Norway, though you live no longer than Olaf Tryggvason, than that you should remain at the level of Sigurdsson and die of old age." Harald, it would seem, took his mother's attitude to heart. He was, if the sagas are to be believed, made of stern stuff, even as a child. When King Olaf stopped by to visit his stepfather, Sigurdsson, in 1018, he apparently took the time to amuse himself by pulling warped and demonic faces at his sons. The two older half-brothers burst into tears. The youngest, Harold, merely glared back at him. Another story has Harold and his brothers asked what they would want in all the world. His elders responded, corn and cattle, whereas Harold laconically replied, warriors. This was the steely young man who backed his half-brother's expedition to his homeland in 1030. Olaf marched his meagre force northwards towards Trondheim, selecting a raised area of ground nearby as his camp. However, at Stiklestad on July 29th, Olaf's restoration was brutally cut short. A larger force of around 5,000 pro-Canute levies under the command of, among others, Kalf Arneson, marched on his position. Trapped and probably worried at the enemy's superior numbers, Olaf, with Harold in tow, decided to seize the initiative by charging downhill into the larger army. This seemed to work at first, with Olaf's hardened mercenaries buckling the front line of their enemies. Unfortunately, the ranks behind simply absorbed the impact. Olaf's whole force was then flanked, surrounded, and cut to pieces. Olaf himself is famously said to have died leaning against a rock, though he was wounded several times before this. As for Harald, he too was wounded seriously enough to be rescued by a comrade and nursed back to health by a peasant family. His wounds healed enough to travel, Harald travelled east towards Sweden, with a line of poetry even attributed to him on the journey, at once both highlighting the young man's disappointment and grief, yet supreme self-confidence, even after defeat. From corpse to corpse I crawl, and creep now worthless. Who knows how highly I'll be heralded one day. Harald eventually made his way via Sweden to the court of the now Prince Yaroslav the Wise. Fortunately for Harold, his brother Olaf had had close links with the prince, who had used Norse mercenaries to win his own struggle for power in Kiev. Harald, as Olaf's half-brother, was most welcome in Kiev, provided a strong arm for the prince, even campaigning in the region for 3 years against the Poles and Wends. In keeping with his character, Harold at this time boldly asked his patron for the hand of his daughter Elizabeth, when she came of marriageable age. Perhaps taken aback at the brashness of this distinguished if unworthy young warrior, Yaroslav replied that first he would have to forge a legacy of his own, worthy of his daughter's hand. This fitted well with Harold's own ambitious nature, so he headed to the only place at the time where a Norse warrior could achieve such riches and reputation, the greatest city in the world at the time, Constantinople. In 1034, Harald made his way there and must have been overawed at what he saw. The city was already several hundred years old by Harold's time, and was capital of the Eastern Roman Empire that had long endured after the fall of the West, and would do so, though weakened, till 1453. It was a city of 1 million souls, with street lighting, sewage and drainage systems, hospitals, public baths, aqueducts, libraries, and even luxury shops. The city itself was one of the most heavily fortified places on earth at the time, with 12 miles of high walls and a great harbour overlooking the Bosphorus. Harald, with his recent experience in the army of Yaroslav, had little trouble enrolling into the elite Varangian Guard of the Byzantine Empire. Kievan Rus had long been a link between the imperial and Scandinavian worlds, forming a trade route for both goods and men. During the reign of Emperor Basil II, the Varangians took off as a permanent feature of imperial life. They were crucial to Basil's victory at Abydos in 989 and accompanied him on his campaigns elsewhere. Since the Varangians were foreign hires, and good ones at that, they had no ties to the empire itself and were loyal to the emperor, who paid them. It was the guard who carried out Basil's grisly order to butcher every man, woman and child within 12 districts of the city without hesitation. They also served in Basil's Georgian campaign in 1021, with the guard also heavily involved in the suppression of the Bari revolt, finally achieved in 1018. primary function of the guard was to protect the person of the emperor, and to that end they accompanied him everywhere outside of the palace precinct, which was mainly for coronations, processions, or visits to the hippodrome, though the last of these was the most common. From Basil II's point of view, these Norse mercenaries had proven invaluable. They were expert soldiers, with one of their favourite stratagems being to retreat into stone buildings like churches or houses, then fortifying them and sallying out, often to the shock of their adversaries. They also mastered horsemanship and had an aptitude for fighting on ground that other units would balk at. Night operations too were standard, as was guerrilla warfare. Another notable aspect of the Guard, apart from its elite status, was its iron discipline on its own members. As a foreign military unit surrounding the top of the imperial pecking order, they naturally attracted a good deal of jealousy and xenophobia, which in turn forged their own community spirit. Varangians retained the right to discipline, even arrest and try their own. One famous instance of this was in the very year that Harold arrived to join their ranks. In 1034, the Guard convened to decide a case of a member who had raped a woman on campaign in Lydia, but who had been run through with his own sword by the same woman. Far from punishing the woman, the guardsmen decided to award the woman her rapist's possessions, and that the dead Varangian be treated as if he had committed suicide, his body left to rot, rather than being given proper burial. It was into this elite and highly regarded and disciplined unit that Harold was enrolled in 1034. Early on, Harold was probably sent as a marine or marine leader on a ship to fight the pirates infesting the Aegean. In this capacity he was ordered to pay the emperor 100 marks from any ship taken, while he and his crew could keep the rest. However, he soon realised that there was no real counting system, and kept much more than this, thus he began to enrich himself. He may also have served in the region between Sicily and Africa, fighting Arab privateers, rather than in the Aegean, as the sources are unclear. For around 2 years from late 1035 onwards, it seems Harold served in Syria and Armenia, though his most famous campaign from this period of his life was in the Sicilian War between 1038 and 41. Like most of the Middle East, North Africa, and large sections of the empire, the island of Sicily had fallen to Muslim conquest a couple of centuries before. Having backed the wrong horse in a conflict between two Arab chieftains, Emperor Michael decided to commit the empire's vast resources into the region. Under the overall command of Georgios Maniacus, Harold commanded some 500 Varangians in this campaign, though the imperial reconquest of Sicily was ultimately a failure. His time here does give a glimpse into his skill as a commander. In one story that may be true, Harold and his guard were besieging a small town, but getting nowhere. Mocked by the inhabitants, Harold decided to set up an athletics tournament just out of missile range of the walls. Over 3 days, he lures the watching inhabitants to a false sense of security by ordering his men not to bring weapons to the event, until on the 3rd and final day they hid some weapons under their cloaks, and took the similarly unarmed onlookers on the wall unawares, shimmying up the walls and thus taking the town. Despite such tales, Harold evidently spent around 2 fruitless years on the island before being redeployed in Bari in southern Italy to put down a Norman-led revolt against Byzantine rule. It was here that Harold likely fought in the 2 great defeats inflicted by the Normans, including at Olivento in March of 1041. Shortly following these defeats, Harold and his Varangians were redeployed in Bulgaria to help smother the revolt there. Having probably taken part in the concluding Battle of Ostrovo towards the end of 1041, Harold and his men returned to the imperial capital, where in December of that eventful year, Emperor Michael IV died. Michael was succeeded by the joint monarchy of Michael V, Michael IV's adopted son, and the dead emperor's wife Zoe. Unfortunately for Harold, he was soon after arrested by Michael V for defrauding the imperial treasury, though in truth it was a common practice for the guard to loot the treasury after their patron's death. Another possibility was that Harold's taking of a greater share than was legally permissible was finally catching up with him, as withholding loot from the imperial coffers could also be construed as fraud. Other more fanciful accounts are that Harald had raped a noblewoman, or that he was arrested for murder. In truth, it's likely that any or all of these excuses could have been used by Michael simply to remove a loyal lieutenant, the previous emperor. Worse still, Michael disbanded the Varangians, seeking to replace it with a Scythian bodyguard, and then proceeded to banish his co-ruler Zoe under the pretense that she had tried to poison him. He proclaimed her sister, Theodora, as her successor. However, this deposition proved extremely unpopular. Michael himself was overthrown in his turn, replaced by the restored Zoe, who then ruled with Theodora briefly. In the process, Harald and his fellow Varangians had been restored to their ranks and privileges. It was around this time, having seen the inside of an imperial dungeon, that Harald made moves to leave imperial service. But, before doing so, he may have performed the last grisly service for Zoe, who remarried soon after, placing Constantine IX on the imperial throne. Michael V was blinded, castrated, and sent to a monastery, as is imperial tradition, and possibly by Harald's own hand. In 1042, Harald was around 27 years old, and had amassed a huge personal fortune, following, and experience. In late 1042, he petitioned Constantine IX to be allowed to leave imperial service, though was bluntly refused. Harald's eagerness to leave may not have been wholly because of homesickness. In his time there, the bastard son of his half-brother Olaf, Magnus, had been recalled to Norway to take up his father's kingship. The overlordship of Canute, who had died in 1035, obviously not being to the great lord's tastes after all. This turnaround was stark, and Magnus was even supported in his return by his father's opponent at Stiklestad, and, some think killer, Olaf Haraldson, among others. Despite the objections of both Zoe and Constantine IX, Harald left, purchasing 2 galleys, and with his retinue sailed north through the Black Sea and onwards into Kievan Rus, to a warm welcome from Yaroslav, who eagerly gave his daughter Elizabeth's hand in marriage to Harald. For reasons that remain obscure, Harald tarried in Yaroslav's lands for around 2 years, though perhaps he did so as a favour to his father-in-law, advising him after the recent disastrous Rus-Byzantine conflict. Harald had amassed a great hoard of treasure during his years of imperial service. Perhaps it also took some time to get his affairs in order. Whatever the reason, Harald did finally set sail for home in a ship so heavily laden with gold and treasure that it almost sank. During his absence, much had occurred. Yes, his nephew Magnus had been installed as the King of Norway following Canute's death, but in Denmark, Canute's son, by his Norman Queen Emma, Harthor Canute, had taken the crown following his father's death. In England, meanwhile, another son of Canute by his first wife, Harold, had established himself as king there. It was still early days, however, in the struggle for the remnants of Canute's North Sea Empire. In 1036, Harthor Canute recognised Magnus as the King of Norway, and vice versa. It was further agreed in a separate pact that should either man die, then the other should inherit their kingdom. This agreement would later form the basis of Harald Sigurdsson's own claim to England, as Harthor Canute's additional claim to the crown of England, a claim he pressed successfully in 1040, was assumed to be included. Thus Magnus, and then later his co-ruler and successor, also supposedly inherited the claim. As for Norway, Magnus had troubles enough there. He publicly accused Olaf Haraldson of murdering his father Olaf at Stiklestad on the very site of the battlefield itself, which prompted Olaf to flee into exile the very same night. Magnus then turned his attention to the other great men of the realm, who he saw as responsible for his father's downfall, and began confiscating the property of those nobles involved in the battle. However, Magnus was well advised and counselled to rein back his desire for revenge, which he wisely did, thus earning the epithet we know him by today, Magnus the Good. In 1042, Harthor Canute's short reign in England ended, and saw the ascension of Edward. the surviving son of King Ethelred the Unready, as King of England. More importantly for Magnus, as per their 1036 agreement, he moved to claim Denmark for his own. In the event, he was proclaimed king without a fight. He wrote to Edward in England, formally accepting his ascension as king, but stating he would retain his right to the throne after he died. Such bold assertions were maybe too bold, given that apart from England, Magnus's hold over Denmark was itself disputed. Sweyn, the son of Jarl Ulf and Astrid, Canute the Great's sister, claimed the throne as a grandson of Sweyn Forkbeard. Sweyn had initially, and at least openly, submitted to Magnus in a meeting on the Gotha River in 1038, and he was rewarded by being made a Jarl in Denmark, and then Magnus's vice-regent. Sweyn bided his time, allowing Magnus to wear down his strength in a conflict with the Jomsborg Revolt, 1043, before striking after Magnus had demobilized his army. Sweyn invaded with an army lent him by the King of Sweden. Accepting the submission of the peoples of Lund, Zealand and Funen, his success was to be short-lived, as Magnus, after defeating the Wends again, who had reignited their revolt upon seeing Sweyn strike, moved to face Sweyn himself and defeated him in a sea battle on 18th of December 1043. Magnus remained in Denmark until 1044, before returning north only for events to repeat themselves once more. Sweyn moved into Denmark as soon as Magnus left, and Magnus returned, inflicting an even heavier defeat on Sweyn off of northern Jutland. By 1045, Magnus was at his peak as a king. Having secured his grip on both Norway and Denmark, he had seen off Sweyn's attempt to wrest the Danish crown away from him, and incensed by a reply he had received from King Edward in England that it was he and not Magnus who rightfully ruled, was even at this point contemplating an invasion of England to claim the throne for himself. Sweyn, however, was back, and by this time supported by Harald Sigurdsson. The two began their campaign by raiding the Danish coast in a bid to undermine King Magnus's authority, as if the latter could not protect the peoples there, then why should they hold him to be their lord? This strategy worked, although a little too well for Sweyn's purposes. Magnus, likely realising an alliance between Harold and Sweyn could prove his undoing, successfully uncoupled the two by offering Harald his uncle, and Harald alone, compromise. Harald would be made co-ruler of Norway with Magnus, while Magnus retained rule of Denmark alone, and overlordship over the entire realm. This obviously did not decisively deal with the Sweyn problem, but did offer Harald a path to power. For Magnus, the writing was on the wall. Brilliant as he was, he could not sleep easy in his bed, with his uncle on the loose, as an experienced and rich alternative to himself, and would never be able to leave Norway again, for fear Harald would slip in, have himself declared king, with his large following backing him in his absence. Sweyn too would be free, in this case, to wage war on Denmark with impunity. What's more, Magnus's wars had drained his treasury, and his uncle had plenty of coin, though the sources are divided on whether Harald truly shared half or any of his vast fortune with his nephew. None of this really mattered in the long run, as after just a year of uneasy rule with Magnus, Harald was left as sole king of Norway when Magnus died on 25th of October 1047. Magnus, however, had, perhaps out of spite, undermined his uncle's authority from the off by naming his betrayed former ally, Sweyn Estrefsson, as successor in Denmark. Indignant, Harald immediately launched naval attacks on the coast of Denmark, but the conflict between the two settled quickly into a back and forth of Harald seizing territory in the region before, on his return to Norway, Sweyn simply swept in to reclaim them. This deadly dance played out over 12 years, though Harald did have some successes, for example in 1049, capturing and burning Hedby. By 1062, likely under pressure from his subjects due to the constant attacks, Sweyn Estrefsson agreed to settle matters with Harald at a final confrontation, the agreed place being at the mouth of the Nisa River. On 9th of August, Harald's 300 or so ships found no enemy ships awaiting them, and so he dismissed around half of his fleet. This proved a mistake, as Harold learned Sweyn was heading his way after all. Both men lashed their ships together. Sweyn advanced on Harold's smaller fleet, the two exchanging arrow shot, or coming together in bloody melee. Despite his smaller numbers, Harold's men proved hard to crack, as deadlock ensued into the night. Yet Harald was not deluded, and soon realised that sheer numbers would hand Sweyn the victory, unless he changed the odds. To this end, he ordered Jarl Hakon on his flank to manoeuvre his detached longboats to assault Sweyn's left. This proved decisive, buckling the first line of ships, causing Sweyn's remaining vessels to flee. Harold's victory then was impressive, having triumphed against superior numbers, yet ultimately indecisive, as Sweyn lived, and the majority of his fleet escaped Nisa. Apart from his conflict with Sweyn, Harold's rule was stormy. Another of his infamous nicknames, the Thunderbolt of the North, earned in this period, as he was a scourge to Danish islands and lands. Harold too had a reputation for plunder, more in tune with his fierce pagan ancestors of old than of a Christian prince, notably sacking the churches of Aarhus and Slesvig, as well as redirecting funds away from church use to his own war chest. Harold's reign was not entirely negative. Norway undoubtedly enjoyed a prosperous period economically under his rule. This was partially due to all the loot brought back from his frequent raids on Denmark, as well as the stimulus for growth caused by Harold's demand for war gear for the same conflict. The demand-driven inflation generated by his vast Byzantine hoard also contributed in no small measure to this. Another key aspect of Harold's reign was his standardization of the coinage, as well as the volume of said coinage, which paints its own picture in terms of economic prosperity. Despite these successes though, Harold today is not primarily known for his fiscal nous. His most enduring legacy as King of Norway was his strengthening of the monarchy, began all the way back with Harald Fairhair, and built upon by Tryggvason, and then Olaf Haraldson, his half-brother. Harald proved himself a very different political animal from his nephew Magnus, who had trod a clever line between alienating his great men and being their puppet, doing neither. Harald had no qualms about putting the petty kings in their place, ordering many expulsions and even murders to this end. Harald was enormously aided in his efforts of centralisation by the cult of St. Olaf that had built up following the king's death at Stiklestad. The cult's own emphasis on royal authority as natural, as opposed to the unnatural intransigence of the oligarchs, reinforced Harold's own designs. By the early 1050s, Harold had killed off or exiled most of those great men who could oppose his direct rule. It is this drive towards direct, absolute monarchy that also led to his other famous epithet, Hardrada, or the Hard Ruler. 1062 changed nothing in the deadlock for Denmark. 2 years later, around the same time that Earl Harald Godwinson was making his famous visit to Normandy and allegedly swearing his oath, Harald and Sweyn agreed an unconditional peace. Sweyn was recognised as the rightful king of Denmark, and Harald as the rightful king of Norway, with war between them to cease for as long as both men lived. By 1064, King Harold Hardrada was in his 50th year. His legend and reputation, known throughout Europe, was in deference to this mighty status that Tostig, the exiled brother of the newly crowned King of England, appealed for aid sometime in 1066. As recounted in the detailed previous episode on Fulford and the events leading to the Northumbrian Revolt, Tostig had been the Earl of Northumbria since 1055, but in 1065 doubled taxes in the region, sparking a rebellion which was co-opted by the brothers Edwin and Morcar, men of a rival English family. Reluctantly, Harold Godwinson, at the time the most powerful noble in the kingdom, sided with the rebels against his own brother, and forced Tostig's exile to avert a civil war would have severely weakened England in the face of imminent invasion. Infuriated with his brother's betrayal, Tostig tried to enlist the aid of other great men, even apparently having an audience with William, Duke of Normandy himself, as he prepared his own invasion in northern France, but to no avail. Sweyn Estrithson also rejected a possible invasion to press his own claim to England. which caused Tostig to either send envoys to Harald or even meet with him in person. Whatever the case, Harald agreed to invade England and claim its crown with Tostig's aid, and to restore Tostig to his earldom of Northumbria. Harald departed Norway in August of 1066, stopping off in the Orkneys before sailing south. Having ravaged Scarborough, he sailed into the Humber estuary, joining up with Tostig as promised before heading inland and making final landfall at Rickle. On 20th of September 1066, Harald and Tostig moved inland with around half of their 12,000 strong army, making for the important city of York. However, they were blocked by Tostig's arch-enemies, the Earls Edwin and Morcar. Still smarting from his recent defeat during the summer in Lincolnshire, Tostig relished a chance to bloody the lines of his hated enemy Morcar. Harald allowed this, placing his English ally with a smaller contingent on the right, while he and his larger and veteran men faced Earl Edwin on the left. Morcar was equally eager to fight Tostig, and charged across the Germany Beck, driving Tostig back. However, Harald moved swiftly against Edwin's smaller force, driving them away en route. Hardrada then simply turned his men about and closed the pincer on Morcar, finishing the victory. This victory was a promising start. Tostig must have assured Harald that soon all the North, already traditionally pro-Viking, would soon rally behind him on his march south. Indeed, on 24th September, York itself surrendered to him, agreeing to feed Harold's men, as well as handing over hostages and joining his march south. It is now that we shift our attention south, as already King Harold Godwinson was active, despite the fact that he could not have known about Fulford itself so quickly. Months before, Harold had set the seal on his new settlement with Edwin and Morcar by confirming the latter as Earl in place of his brother Tostig, while marrying their sister Edith, who would in turn be Queen. The Earls too would support Harold, which they did, when King Edward died in January of 1066. The ink on this agreement between him and the Northern Earls was barely dry, yet it appears from the chronology of events that the king had little faith in his new allies' chances. The sacking of Scarborough and the dispersal of Morcar's levies on Holderness a few days before Fulford must have leaked down to Harold and convinced him that the threat was far worse than a small band of raiders. King Harold had spent the summer keeping watch over the south coast for Duke William's likely invasion, but had been forced to demobilise the Fyrd, or levies, as the legal term of service had expired, and the harvest needed to be brought in. Now, upon the news of this new threat, the king called his brother Gurth to him, along with their housecarls and any other remaining men they could spare, and headed north. The speed of this march has often awed historians, although it is likely Harold and Gurth's core force was mounted, and he picked up the majority of his army as he advanced. Indeed, Harold probably sent messages ahead of him as he advanced, with other groups, such as the aforementioned levies of Holderness and other small groups, being absorbed as he went. In any case, Harold's army covered around 190 miles in 4 days, so whatever way you look at it, this was an impressive feat, and would prove partially decisive as events unfolded. Back near York, Harald Hardrada had negotiated the taking of 150 children, prominent families of Yorkshire, into his custody, and also agreed to give up his own hostages in exchange. On the evening of the 24th of September, the Norse returned to Rickle, a short distance away, laden with loot from York, which had been extracted as a peace offering. Harald was satisfied, though his most pressing need was not surety for York's loyalty, but food for his large host. The location chosen for both the handover of both the hostages and the assembling of the food was Stamford Bridge, several miles to the northeast on the Derwent, a tributary of the River Ouse. This was a suitable area to assemble the cattle and grain needed, and so it was all set. The next day, on Monday 25th September 1066, was bright and hot, a fact that unwittingly sealed the fate of the great Hardrada. Crucially, he allowed his men to march the short distance to Stamford Bridge, with the minimal equipment. Under the sweltering sun, many men discarded their mail shirts, helmets, shields, and heavier weapons, with many only taking with them spears, bows, and swords. To be fair to Harold, there was no real reason to be cautious in his march. Just days before they had seen off the local force, smashing the spirit of the English under the local earls. There was no way any serious force remained close to challenge them. Harold further compounded his error by taking with him only around half of his full force, the men setting off with Tostig and their king in high spirits. Meanwhile, King Harold Godwinson and his exhausted army had arrived in Tadcaster late on the 24th of September. It was probably now that he learned of the fate of Edwin and Morcar's army at Fulford, and of York's subsequent submission. Harold likely left Tadcaster at around 6 AM and reached York in what must have been an awkward few moments around 9. King Harold actually had two options to choose from. He could assault the larger Norse force at Rickle, along with their ships, or move to engage the smaller army at Stamford Bridge under Hardrada. Harold decided on the latter, following the Roman road via the Gate Helmsley towards Stamford Bridge. Amazingly, given Harold's army outnumbered the Norse, even if they had been together, his quarry's first indication that they were in danger was when the English began to emerge over the brow running down from Gate Helmsley to Stamford Bridge. The Norsemen could not have been in a worse position. Most of them were on the right side of the bridge, collecting cattle, evidently having not bothered to post scouts on the approaching road. The bridge itself must have been guarded, as we shall see, but a smaller collection of men also lounged lazily on the left side of the bridge, as in the distance many of them must have wondered at the line of dust obscuring the horizon. With the pieces set in place, King Harold, ever the diplomat, rode to the foot of Stamford Bridge itself, 20 of his housecarls to parley. Hardrada, Tostig, and a small bodyguard rode out to meet them. Harold, posing as his own herald, addressed his brother, promising that if he returned to the Godwinson family, he would not only be reinstated as Earl of Northumbria, but would also receive a third of all of England to rule. However, when Tostig asked what his ally King Harold Hardrada would receive, his brother's demeanour darkened, with the reply, "We will give him 7 feet of ground, or as much more as he needs, as he is taller than other men." Tostig, to his credit, rejected this generous offer, saying he would not have it said of him that he had brought the King of Norway to England, only to betray him. He then turned on his horse and rode away. Harold followed him, curious as to know the identity of the man who had spoke so boldly. When Tostig revealed it had been his own brother, King Harold, Hardrada gruffly replied that had he known, he would have killed him on the spot. Pleasantries dispensed with, battle began on the York side of the Derwent. The Norse vanguard fought a heroic delaying action against the full might of the English army to buy time for their comrades on the right side. The Norse managed to hold up the English far longer than expected. It is here that we hear of the famous legend of a giant Norse warrior holding up the English army alone, swinging his great battle axe. According to the legend, this valiant Norseman killed some 40 English warriors before finally being skewered from below by a wily Englishman who had either waded into the river underneath or taken a boat. It was around 3 PM when the English began to stream across the bridge to get to grips with Hardrada's main force. The Norwegian king had deployed his men some 300 yards away on a section of high ground. Hardrada's line was long but thin, and he had refused his line to try and guard against a flanking manoeuvre, effectively creating a circle. He also kept his own elite retinue slightly back. All this was for nothing, given they were simply outnumbered, largely without armour, and soon the shield wall was breached, the Norse being cut down in their hundreds. Seeing this, Hardrada charged headlong into the thick of battle, by some accounts dual-wielding a massive battle axe and sword, though, even in his berserker fury, he was struck down with an arrow to the throat, the great Hardrada sinking slowly to his end. Harold Hardrada's fall inevitably caused a lull in the fighting, though not a rout of the Norse. King Harold, even now hoping to avoid further bloodshed, offered the surviving Norse their lives if they surrendered. However, Tostig, upon learning of his allies' death, rallied the Norwegians around Land Ravager, Hardrada's banner, and roared their defiance, being cut down in Hardrada's turn around their slain lord. Tostig and his Flemish mercenaries fell at this point, while the English drove many of their foes into the Derwent to drown. And that really should have been that. Well, no, not really. Before the main clash had begun, King Harold Hardrada sent out messengers to Rickle to urgently request reinforcements. Evidently, Eystein Ori had received these, as now he arrived, too late to save his king. Ori had approached the English from a different route. Unlike Hardrada's under-equipped force, Ori's fully armoured and equipped contingent almost succeeded in breaking the English line, thus giving the event its legendary name, the Storm of Ori. Yet brave as it was, Ori and all his lieutenants shared the fate of their great king. Harold Godwinson had won an astounding, if bloody, victory, but at an unacceptably high cost. Even fighting Hardrada's weakened force, he took heavy casualties, which was only compounded by Ori's charge. Still, the English king's losses were as nothing compared to the Norse, almost the entire army being wiped out. The sagas probably exaggerate the losses by stating that only 24 of the 300 ships used to ferry Hardrada's invasion force were needed to transport the bloodied remnant back to Norway. Even so, these numbers can't be far off. The English pursued the surviving Norse back to Rickle and burnt a portion of the fleet there. King Harold, however, proved merciful even after such a crushing victory. The remnants at Rickle were now under the command of Hardrada's surviving son, Olaf, who asked Harold for terms. Harold allowed Olaf to depart, upon swearing never to return under arms to England again. Back at the battlefield, Harold had Tostig's body recovered and buried at York, though his comrades were not so lucky, their bones remaining there to bleach for years to come. King Harold Hardrada did escape this fate, his remains eventually being collected in 1067 and finding its final resting place in St. Mary's Church at Trondheim. Thus ended the journey of the last great Viking. Alas, for Harold Godwinson, the war was far from over. He rested at York for 2 days before he resolved once more to head south, in the full knowledge he faced yet another invader, and one perhaps even deadlier than that he had just vanquished. The army that had fought at Stamford Bridge was in no way capable of making the march south, so Harold headed back with just his housecarls. He made it back to London in around 8 days, only to be greeted with the news he most certainly dreaded. Just 3 days after Stamford Bridge, the Normans had made landfall at Pevensey, and were now ravaging Sussex. Next episode, we conclude this trilogy on the Year of Three Battles, with a comprehensive look at the iconic Battle of Hastings, as well as into the characters, events, and history leading up to it. So subscribe and click the notification button for that. We shall see you next time.